Hi everyone, good evening. My name is Diane Chee and I'm Assistant Curator Peranakan at the Asian Civilisations Museum and the Peranakan Museum. Welcome to the sixth lecture in the ACMtalks series supported by the Chris Foundation. This lecture is titled A Portrait, a Name and a History of Chinese Womanhood in Dutch Colonial Java. And our speaker tonight is Dr. Seng Guo-Quan. Dr. Seng Guo-Quan is Assistant Professor of History at the National University of Singapore, and he researches and teaches the trans-regional histories of Chinese migration and settlement, the formation and dissolution of empires, and the rise of nation states and capitalism at the intersection of the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. His research on the history of Chinese communities in Southeast Asia focuses in particular on changing gender and ethnic formations over space and time. And he is currently working on a book manuscript titled Intimate Strangers, Gender and the Chinese Border in Colonial Indonesia. I'm sure you're all looking forward to hearing from Dr. Seng. Guo-Quan, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Diane. Let me just share my screen. Thanks, Diane, for the introduction, and thank you, Peranakan Museum, for the invitation, and thanks to everyone for tuning in, right, at this time of the day. So today, my talk is entitled Behind the Ancestral Screen, a Portrait, a Name and a History of Chinese Womanhood in Dutch Colonial Java. When Diane got in touch with me a few months ago now, right, with this photo, I was intrigued, right, and when she revealed that she is Patoe Nio, right? A bulb kind of lit up in my mind. Oh, I think I kind of have heard of this family, right? And so today, I'm going to invite you to join me on this journey, right? To find out my journey, right, together with Diane, who exactly was Patoe Nio, right? And I've structured my talk around the three themes and three answers I've found over the past few months, right? There is the Patoe Nio on the ancestral screen, right? It is an ancestral portrait, right? That's connected to a religious way of life. I put it in parentheses because even though many Chinese Indonesians may no longer be what they call Konghuchi or Confucianist, right? But many of them have retained, right, this way of life. And then there's the Patoe Nio that's behind the ancestral screen, right? She is a name, right? That's what we had at the beginning, right? But as we dug further, right, a personality kind of emerged, right? And this personality has remained active, right, among her descendants, right, in the genealogical memory, right? And their research to find out more about their own heritage has been aided by recent archival and historical advances. So I'll share a little bit about that. And then finally, beyond the ancestral screen, right? I think it's very befitting that as this portrait is moving from private possession, right, into a public museum, that we also take a step back, right, to see where it stands, right, in history, right, and in particular, right, what can we say about, right, the history of Chinese womanhood in Indonesia and in Southeast Asia, right, through this portrait. So on the right, amazingly, we actually have a photograph, right, of Patoe Nio. We are guessing maybe roundabouts, right, in her late teens or early 20s, right, round about the time she got married. Now, on the ancestral screen, right, let me first talk about the Patoe Nio, right, on the ancestral screen. These are photos of Chinese houses, right, in the mid to late 19th century in urban Java, right, mostly Batavia, except the one on the bottom right. That's a contemporary photo, right? But on the left column, right, you see Kapitan's houses, right, towards the end of the 19th and in the early 20th centuries, right? Many of them not only lived in this, right, traditionally Chinese houses, right? But they also bought over, right, many of the what the Dutch called a landhouse, right? The plantation house that's been vacated as they return to Europe. In the middle, we see the kind of dwellings that Chinese middle class, your warung holders, right? Your warung keepers, warung owners, toko holders, right? The quintessential, right? Chinese middleman, shop owner, right? They lived in shop houses that really were across Southeast Asia, right? Since the mid 18th century. And we tend to have the impression that, right, the Chinese Indonesians are also wealthy, right? That is true to a certain extent, but also a caricature, right? There are also poor Chinese, right? The Chinese also live in kampong, right? And the bottom right, unfortunately, in the colonial period, I haven't been able to find such a photo, right? But this phenomena began, right, as people in the countryside began to migrate to the big colonial cities, Batavia, Semarang, Surabaya, right? The urban kampongs grew in between the shop fronting the major thoroughfares, right? It's in the small alleyways up to this day, right? That you can find all these makeshift structures, what the Indonesians call the kampong, right? As opposed to the desa that's really in the countryside. Now, the colonial photographers never really went into the dwellings, right? In the way that if you search, let's say, the Leiden University library catalog, right? You'll find a lot of pictures of the interiors, right, of European dwellings. From my own travels in Java, right, it's not hard to find, right, ancestral worship still being practiced, right? And in this slide, I'm showing you some of the practices, some of these that I've encountered, right, in the wealthier houses, right? So on the right, it's a town that I won't name, right, but it's somewhere in central Java, right? I've pixelated the photo to protect the identity, right? But as you can see, right, this is a European house, but it's been converted into a Chinese dwelling, and that's the screen, right? That's the screen that I'm talking about. It's most obvious symbolically, right, in a wealthy Chinese house, and we can think back to maybe half a century ago or even a century ago, where in front of the screen, right, that's where, you know, guests are received, right, where the male folk of the family meet, you know, their business partners, you know, their European business partners or officials, but the women's quarters, right, the kitchen, you know, the inner quarters, they're all behind the screen, right? So in that sense, that's what I mean by, right, women in a way being behind the ancestral screen. A portrait like Patoe Nio's, right, would be, of course, on the screen itself, right? And in some families, right, they have moved all the ancestral tablets, all the portraits into what they call rumah abu, right? Literally an ash house, right? The ash refers to the you know, the ash in the urn in which we stick the incense, right? But rumah abu is really what in the academic language we call the ancestral hall, right? And that's for the bigger lineages, right? But in most houses, right, they have retained, right, the few generations that are closer to them, their own ancestors, right? In cases where they haven't come together to form a big lineage group, right? These practices are still very much part of their everyday life, right? So in this case, for instance, right, I was so surprised to see that the two hand-painted portraits in the middle, right, they should go back to the mid 19th century, if not earlier, right? And in contrast to Patoe Nio's portrait, it's a tinted photograph, right? That would have come late 19th century, right? Early 20th century, right? So we can see a progression, right, through time of ancestral portraits. So that's for the wealthy Chinese. For the middle class Chinese, right? So whenever I visit my good friend Pak Udaya Halim's museum in Tangerang, right? For those of you who visit Jakarta, right, do drop by. It's a museum of Chinese heritage. I love to walk around in Tangerang, right? It's a small town, right? There's a Chinese enclave there. And just peering into people's houses. Again, I've pixelated them to protect people's identities. You could see, right, that these practices are still alive, right? And then among the urban poor, right? On this occasion, I was actually visiting the first ever officer, right? The first Kapitan of Batavia, Kapitan Sao Bengkon, right? And it's also a story of this urban sprawl of Jakarta, right? His grave, his tomb has been taken over, right, by a kampong, right? And it's actually villagers who are living literally on top of it, right? They dry their clothes on it. They are the ones who are taking care of it, right? And it's in these little alleyways, right? It's found tucked in between these alleyways. So and there, around there, right, all over Jakarta, you also see cases of, right, poor Chinese living in these urban kampongs, right, and you can see that, right, the ancestral worship is also alive among them. So that's my first answer to the question, right? Who was Patoe Nio? My second answer, right? And this takes us behind the ancestral screen to look at some of the intellectual and intellectual labor that's been put into the archival and genealogical sources. Some of you may have heard of the Guo-Quan papers, right? These are the minutes of the meetings of the Chinese Council of Batavia, right? The assembled Chinese officers or Kapitans of Batavia. In and of itself is a wonderful story, right? It's been chucked away somewhere in some warehouse, right? It's rotting, and the community leaders felt like they had to do something, right? And along came the charismatic Leiden historian, right? Leonard Bluze, right? And in agreement with the community leaders of Indonesia, yeah, Ibu Mira, Siddhartha, right? He undertook to take them to Leiden, sort them out, right, and open them up for research. And that's indeed what he's done, right, in the last 30 years or so. And we have to be grateful to Prof. Bluze. On the left, you see the physical state of the archives, right? It's sitting in the Sinological Library in Leiden University. Meng Hong, Chen Meng Hong, and Monique Erkelens, right? The caretaker, researcher, and they have published 2 wonderful dissertations on the Chinese of Batavia, right? Through these archives. The council minutes have also been transcribed and annotated, right? And published in I forgot 16 or 17 volume set, right? So besides the council minutes, another very important part of this archives, right, is the marriage registries, right? The marriage registries run from, well, they started registering from 1717, right? But what has survived through the Java Wars is gone, right? The mid-18th century Java War, that's gone. But from the late 18th century onwards, right? Although we have some gaps, by and large, we have a continuous run of Chinese marriages registered with the Kapitans, right? Until the system was abolished in 1919, right? And then when the civil registry took over. So that's where we found something about Patoe Nio, right? And let me show you. I just found this actually a few days ago, right? And this is marriage registration. Let me take you through it very quickly from right to left, right? Number 36, on the order of the governor, this is a marriage between, right, the groom and the bride, Patoe Nio and Gao Kiang Jian. She's actually a year older, right, than the groom, and they both live on Jalan Asamka. Today, if you come out of the Kota railway station, is just north of it, right smack in the center of old Kota, the Chinatown there, right? Li Patoe Nio, she goes by another name, right? Li Hok Nio, but it's interesting. These characters are not typical characters for Chinese names, right? I have speculated that it might be a corruption of Batu, right? It might be Sepatu, shoe, right? But it's very common for the Peranakan, right, to really go by, a very insignificant given name, right? The stone, the shoe, rather than, right, the given Chinese name. And this is all the more significant because, right, she was given that she was a daughter of a Chinese Kapitan. Now, the people who signed the registries, right, today it would be the bride and groom, right, being solemnized and signing together with the witnesses, right? But back then, in this colonial Chinese arrangement, right, it was the brides and grooms' guardians, right? And in this case, right, she's a daughter of the most powerful Chinese, right, appointed by the Dutch, Mayo Li Chu Hong, Xia, right? The Xia indicates a certain sort of aristocratic status, right? And on the groom side, right, is an honorary lieutenant, right, Gao Lam Yang, also Xia. And interestingly, as I was looking through the registries, right, Gao Lam Yang had absented himself just a few days before this, right? Another granddaughter was married, right? And on account of illness, he sent his son to, right, witness or to sign that registry. But just a few days later, right, when it's the Mayo himself who's, right, whose daughter, his granddaughter is marrying, right? He had to be there. Now, the other interesting thing about this registry is if you look at how they are signing the names, right? Although all the minutes are recorded in Chinese, right? All the Kapitans by this time, in fact, from the early 19th century onwards, they were signing their names in Romanized form, right? Meaning that they're all Peranakan, they've lost Chinese, right? They might be able to understand, right? Spoken Hokkien, right? But in terms of writing, right? It's probably Malay, it's probably Dutch. Now, the 6 rights, 6 li, right? 6 rights Confucian marriage will not be complete without the go-betweens, right? And the colonial system has honored this, right? It's part of the registration that you need the go-betweens to authenticate that this was indeed, right? They had a part to play in this. And interestingly, right, they were illiterate, so they signed their names with 2 crosses. And then finally, from this, we can also tell that the actual ritual marriage was carried out on 29th of March, right? But it was more than a week later, on the 8th of April, that they went to the Kapitan's office to get it registered. Now, from the genealogical research, what we know, right, is that Li Patoe Nio, that's the younger her, right, is a descendant of, was the descendant of 3 generations of Chinese officers, right? Of course, her father, Li Chu Hong, attained the highest rank, right? And even in her own generation, right? One of her brothers, Li Chen Chun, right, was appointed Kapitan in the 1910s. Before I go on, let me just also highlight how, right, the genealogical research, right? So this graph comes out of the late Steve Hariono's research, right? As I mentioned earlier, right, he's assembled all the genealogies, right, of the major families, right, and only published some of them, right, in this wonderful book, Perkawinan Strategis, right? And on the top right, S.Y. Khan and M.S. Khan, right? S.Y. is a retired aeronautical engineer living in the Netherlands, right? He left Indonesia in the late 60s, I think. But in retirement, right, he's turned to genealogical research, and with the help of Meng Hong in Leiden, right, they've been able to, and of course, Dutch newspapers have been digitized and, right, it's searchable online, right? He's been able to piece together, right, the entire family tree. And if you go to his website, right, there are so many wonderful stories of, right, what happened to this ancestor and that ancestor, right? So Li Patoe Nio, descendant of 3 generations of Chinese officers. One of her sisters, right, married another Gao, right? This is what in anthropology is called the parallel cousin marriage, right? Which is quite common among the Peranakans. And then her brother, right, Kapitan Li, married the very famous Ao Chui Lan, right, who is known for starting Hati Suchi, a shelter for trafficked Chinese women. And her youngest sister, right, by another mother, married Kan Hok Hui, right, the longest lasting Volksrat, or the Legislative Council Chinese member, right, the most important, politically most important Chinese in late colonial Java. So, you know, this, if you read Haryono's book, right, this is repeated across all of Java, right? They are all connected, right, by marriage. And if we read James Rush's book, we'd think that this is something that happened only in the 19th century with the opium farms, right? But in fact, it carried on into the 20th century. Now, on her husband's side, right, her husband is a descendant of, right, 2 generations of Kapitans. And remarkably, right, for her 2 daughters, right, she was able to arrange marriages for them, right, with 2 other Kapitan families. Okay, so we have, so Li Patoe Nio is beginning to come to life, right? It's not much, right? But women didn't leave behind a lot of records, and from what we have, right, assembled from the memories of, right, descendants, from the marriage registry, from, you know, 19th and early 20th century newspaper records, that's what we have. Let me now move to my third answer, right, to this question of, you know, who was this woman, right? And let me take you beyond the ancestral screen, right, to talk about the history of the Chinese in Indonesia and the history of Chinese in Southeast Asia, and that how, you know, this history has very much been a history of Kapitans, of the strong men, of the revenue farmers, right, and even when we talk about families, right, it tends to be about the patriarchs, right? So these are some of the more representative works, right, in the last 20 years or so of the Chinese in Java. So in my own work, right, I look at the gender formation. I look at Chinese identity at the intersection of race and gender, right? Who were these Peranakan or Creole Chinese women, right? If we look at the demographic history, from the time the Dutch started counting their population, right? The remarkable story about the Chinese in Java is that the sex ratio or the gender ratio, right, was fairly balanced, right? If you compare this with the Strait settlements, right, Singapore, Penang, and Malacca, right, it's the contrast cannot be more stark, right? So by and large, until 1900, right, male and female numbers are more or less balanced, right? And I've made this move, right? This is something that Skinner has done to extrapolate. Bill Skinner has done to extrapolate Peranakan versus Totok numbers, right, in 19th century Java, right? This is really borrowing from his projection. If we assume that there were equal numbers of male and female born, right, we can actually work out how big was the size of the immigrant newcomer Totok population, right? And these figures are more or less accurate until around 1900, when Chinese women started to, right, migrate to leave China, right? So if you look at the 1860 to 1900 figure, right, it increased very slowly from 6 to 15%, right? And if you contrast this with what's happening in the Straits. By 1900, it's the opposite story, right? The newcomers, the Singke or the Totoks, were around 80 to 90% of the Chinese population, right? Whereas the Peranakans had become the absolute minority, right? About 10 to 15% in the Straits. So I think this bigger demographic picture is important to keep in mind as we are asking this question, sociological question of, right, who were these Creole Chinese women? Now, beyond that, we actually don't know so much more, right? A lot of the scholarship has been based on early 20th century critiques of, right, the old adat and the tradition of the Peranakan Chinese, right? So for instance, Margaret Pauket-Sick, right, in what to my mind is still one of the better studies, right, of Peranakan Chinese women, although she's mainly interested in a story at the early 20th century crossroad, right? So I'll just read it very quickly. Following Chinese tradition, Chinese fathers would concentrate more on the education of their sons, leaving the upbringing of their daughters to their indigenous or Peranakan Chinese wives. In the event of their returning to China, only sons would follow their fathers, but the wives and daughters were usually left behind to quote unquote mind the shop. As a result, women would display a stronger Javanese outlook than the men, so that in the traditional female domain, more Javanese cultural traits were preserved. The Peranakan Chinese woman became more Javanese than the Peranakan Chinese men. This difference could be observed in matters like dress and hairstyle, right? So that's one. And the other image we have, right, of Peranakan Chinese women in the 19th century is that because of them, right, and because of their Javanese culture, right, Chinese patriarchy was moderated, right? And here, Pauket-Sick again, right, talks about how the most important task of the Chinese woman was to bear sons, right, a very Confucian one, right, the more the better, and the highest status she could achieve was to become the mother of successful sons, right? Although the concept was accepted in Peranakan Chinese society, its impact was softened by Javanese tradition, which didn't recognize worship in a form that the Chinese practiced, while in China, the birth of daughters was often regarded as a calamity, particularly in times of economic distress. In Java, the birth of daughters didn't cause such alarm, as long as there were sons to carry on the family name, right? So it's really more an image, right, than something that's based on historical research. So this is where I hope to contribute something in my own research. And I've been looking at divorce, right? The divorce cases that's been recorded in the Chinese Batavia Chinese Council minutes. And this is a typical anthropological move, right? The way to study something is not in what people say they are, right? It's not how people define it, but it's when things break down, right? When things fall apart, right? That's when, if you really look closely, that's what it is, right? So just some key facts that has been preserved in the Guo-Quan archives, right? 509 cases, right? There are some gaps, significant gaps, but there are also years and years of, right, complete runs of cases have been preserved, right? And across the board, right, across the 19th century, remarkably, right, the crude divorce rate fluctuated from between 2 to 10%, right, between the 1820s and 1890s. It peaked in the 1870s, right, at 10+%. Now, what does this mean from a kind of, global perspective, right? This is also the time when Europeans were beginning to legalize divorce, right? Before this, there's no divorce, right? And to just give you some perspective, in the UK and America, right, divorce as late as around the late 19th century was less than 1%, right? And if not, 0.1%. So divorce was really very, very rare. What about the case in China, right? In the one very good study that was done by Janet Tice, right? There was no divorce. There was no divorce in China, right? You could go to the magistrate to get a contract to marry annulled, right? But in most cases, it only ends up in the magistrate's court when a crime happened, right? So it often was the case that, right, the wife dies, right? It becomes a murder case, and then in the course of investigation, right, the breakdown of the conjugal relations, right, the story is unveiled. So it's fairly remarkable, right? It's very remarkable that in the 19th century, in colonial Java, right, divorce was by and large accepted. Of all the suits, right, between 60 and 80%, right, were filed by women, right? It may seem surprising, right, at first glance, but if we take into account the fact that, the Chinese in China and in Java, they were polygamous, right? It's right in that context, it's not surprising, right? Men tended to sit on failed marriages, right? Whereas women were the ones who would take the initiative. And I think if you study contemporary marriage and divorce, that's still the case, right? I'm going to skip this part, right? But of the 20 to 40% filed by men, right? The major complaint was that the women were not staying at home. They were out roaming the streets. They were not coming home. They're not taking care of the household, right? So to show you how this whole institution worked, right? I'm going to bring you through one case. And it just so happens that this case was heard by Li Patoe Nio's father, right? Li Chu Hong in 1874. So you can imagine at that time, she was 9 years old. Her father was already someone important, right? Having to attend council meetings and having to adjudicate disputes, right? Among Chinese couples, right? So in this minute, right, he has another brother who's also a lieutenant at this point in time, right? And he signs his name again in Romanized form, right? So in 1874, 2nd July, right, Cheng Nio was 31 and already married for 13 years to Lau Bun Tek, and had a 13-year-old son with him, right? She went to the pre-trial. So before they went to the main trial, there was a pre-trial, not the full panel of Kapitans, right? But just 2 of them, right? In this case, it's not recorded which Li, right? So it might be Patoe Nio's father, it might be her uncle, but Kapitan Ni and Lieutenant Li were there, right, to record her plea, right? My husband has been away for the past 6 to 7 years. He married a concubine, ignored me, didn't provide half a cent. He sometimes comes home for less than a month and then he will be gone again. I've tolerated all this up to now, right? Remarkable, right? 6 to 7 years. I've been dependent on my father, right? Very important Peranakan trait. They can fall back on their father. Recently, my son fell ill. I got someone to inform him, right? But he didn't care, right? Conscience, right? The Confucian kind of moral framing of the world, right? Has never been more lacking in humanity than this. I plead to be divorced, right? Cheng Nio, right? So this is the pre-trial. And then this report gets submitted to the full panel of Kapitans, right? When they decide to hear, usually they will try to reconcile the couple, right? Why don't you try it out first, right? If it really doesn't work, then you come back again, right? So at the main trial, the husband gets to respond, and he denied what Cheng Nio said. It's false. How could she have survived had I not provided for her, right? There's a conflict with the mother-in-law, and it turns out, right, he is in a uxorial local marriage, right? He's what the Chinese call 进赘, right? Married into the bride's family, right? I've now rented a house. I wish to invite her to come and live with me. I'll take care of her. I don't wish to divorce. So it was thrown back, and she's supposed to go back to the husband. 3 months later, right? The Cheng Nio goes to the Kapitan again, right? And this time round, the officers, right? They've had enough of this irresponsible man, right? If you have feelings for your wife, you should know to provide for her yourself. Why do you need to wait to be asked, right? Since you don't have income, why take another wife? And as part of the trial, right, they actually invited Buntek's employer, who happens to be a medicine hall owner, right? And turns out that he was telling a lie, right? He didn't have a fixed salary, right? He was working in ad hoc fashion for him. So with that, the Kapitans approved the divorce, right? But for a divorce to pass, both parties have to agree to it. And Buntek refused. Buntek refused, right? And 2 weeks later, you read in the council minutes that, okay, because Buntek objected, it was escalated to the Dutch resident, right? And the resident overruled the husband's objection, it was approved. And Cheng Nio was then free, right, to remarry. And this in fact is the sort of the broader picture of the 500 over cases, right? And there is no clear divorce law, right, stating which are the legitimate grounds for divorce, right? But when I first encountered the divorce cases, my first reaction was every divorce has a story of its own, right? But having worked on this for some years, right, you can work out some patterns to it. Desertion, right? The man disappearing and not supporting the family, right? Abuse, and remarkably, right? I think jealousy, jealousy of the concubine, right? This is the third most frequently occurring cause, right, in women's applications for divorce. And then there's eviction, there's tension with the mother-in-law, right? So what does this tell us about, right, the mode of creolization, right? In the earlier scholarship, right, people like Bauketsik, right, in that kind of extrapolation from sort of early 20th century, the image that we get out of those kind of historical extrapolations, right, it tends to be about kinship and culture somehow naturally blending into, right, something softer than the very hard edges of the Chinese patriarchy, right? But if you really study the 19th century sources, right, you'll see that, well, it's quite a remarkable institution of Chinese adat law, right, that the Chinese and the Dutch run together, right? And these patriarchs, people like Patoe Nio's father, right, were actually quite pragmatic, right? They were willing, right? My sense is, if you can't support the family, right, chances are the Kapitans will approve, right? They didn't want to see Chinese women go destitute on the streets, right? And the other argument I'm trying to make is that, in fact, the influence of Islamic legal norms is very important, right? This notion that it is a right of women, right, to file for divorce, right? We take it for granted today, but in the 19th century world, right, Islam was really the most progressive, right, in terms of having divorce institutionalized as a legal norm. It gave women a measure of autonomy, right? And interestingly, so this is where Patoe Nio fits in, comes in, right? The majority of cases were by women who were not that wealthy, right? They could go back to their father, right? But some of them who couldn't go back to their father, right? Within a few months, they would file for divorce, right? And I've zoomed in particularly on the concubine cases, and I found that, right, middle-class women were actually, they had greater autonomy in that sense, right? They were less likely to tolerate polygamy. And ironically, right, is wealthy elite women like Patoe Nio, right, who are most unlikely to file for divorce, even though their husbands, right, like her father herself, right, who had 4 concubines, right, they were right, their husbands were most likely to foster concubines. Okay, so let me conclude. So who was Lee Patoe Nio? I've brought you through the journey of how, right, it's a way of life that we continue to witness, right? It's being practiced among the Chinese Indonesians. It's a name and a personality that has, right, that has become alive, right, in the communal, in the descendants' genealogical memory, right, thanks to all the research that's been done, right, mainly in the Netherlands. And then and this is my contribution to the discussion, right? I think through all these sources, right, Dutch, Chinese, Indonesian, right, we are getting a better picture of, right, what it meant to be Chinese, what it meant to be someone who was, right, not front and center in public life, right, and what we call in historical studies, right, the subalterns, right, we're getting a better picture, right, because of all the sources that become available. So I think I'll end my talk here. If anyone has any questions I'm not able to answer after this, right, feel free to drop me an email. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guo-Quan, for that wonderful talk. Before we move on to the Q&A portion of the evening, I just wanted to briefly provide some context for this lecture from the perspective of the Peranakan Museum. The mission of the Peranakan Museum is to explore the art and culture of Peranakan communities in Southeast Asia. So in light of this, our collection not only covers the material culture of Peranakans of the former Strait settlements, the important Peranakan communities of the former Strait settlements, but also Peranakan communities in Indonesia and other Southeast Asian countries like Myanmar and Thailand. And this portrait really is one of the more recent additions to our collection. But I just wanted to take this opportunity to highlight some other objects from our collection that have a particular link to the sort of communities that Patoe Nio would have been a part of. So the first artifact I wanted to show you is this woman's blouse and skirt, which is strikingly similar to the one that Patoe Nio wears in her more formal portrait. This is from Java, late 19th century or early 20th century, with similar gold thread embroidery in almost identical, with almost identical motifs. Second set of artifacts is this groom's cape and mandarin robe that would have been worn by a Peranakan groom at his wedding. And the photo at right shows you how the robe and the cape would have looked when worn. And the third is this very special wooden carriage that was donated to us in 2017. And this would have been used as part of a Chinese Peranakan ceremony from central Java known as Tedun, which would have marked either a child's first year or when a child begins to walk. So the child would have been put into the carriage and there would have been a particular ceremony. This is the second collar that I'm showing you, also with a pair of rank badges, but this was not part of a groom's outfit. This was actually rank badges and a collar that belonged to the last Kapitan Cina of Madiun in Java in the early 20th century. His name was New Suilian. And to the right, I just wanted to show you a picture of a man wearing very similar clothing. This is Lim Chin Han, and this photograph was taken in Padang, in Sumatra, in 1909. And finally, in 2017, the museum was very fortunate to receive a gift of 100 batiks from the Wee family, which included 3 generations of makers who ran a Chinese Peranakan batik workshop in Pekalongan on the north coast of Java. So this is one of the highlight pieces from that donation. Of course, our special exhibitions across the years have also featured objects from Peranakan communities in Indonesia. So Sarong Kebaya in 2011 showcased a variety of clothing, including this baju peki, which is a more Chinese style dress, although Peranakan women wore all different styles of dress, not only in Indonesia, but in the Strait settlements. In 2014, there was a special exhibition of batik for Peranakan altars, all from Java, including this very special one with the coat of arms of the Dutch East Indies. And in 2016, this memorable pair of gold embroidered boots would have been worn by women like Patoe Nio at the turn of the 20th century for weddings and other formal occasions. And then our last exhibition before we close for renovation in 2019, Amik Gamba, featured many photographs of Peranakans in Indonesia, including this very early photograph of a Peranakan Chinese bride from around the 1860s. So this is just a selection of what we have in our collection, and I hope that you'll be inspired by this talk and just a couple of these images to perhaps explore more of what we have. It's all available on roots.sg. So let me just stop sharing. Obviously, these artifacts only tell part of the story. And so, you know, I'm very grateful that Guo-Quan has agreed to be with us this evening and to share his research, because it really enhances our understanding of how the Peranakans lived, you know, and the position of women in society. So without further ado, let's go to the questions. I see we have 7. Okay. So Connor asks, thank you, Dr. Seng, for a very interesting talk. Sorry, I've just lost the question. But what was the economic power of these women given that they were left minding the store?
Yeah, thanks, Connor. Thanks, Diane. So yeah, that's an intriguing question, right? We have that descriptive passage from Balkit Sikh, and it is something that people talk about, right? European observations of Chinese economic life, right? It's always being noted that, look, when the man is away, right, the women mind the stores, right? Where does their economic power come from, right? So one of the important sources of their social power comes from the kinship system, right? Balkit Sikh is not wrong to say that, right? There is a kind of blending of Chinese and Javanese systems of kinship, and the Javanese and Southeast Asians in general, right? They were what we call bilateral, right? What do I mean by being bilateral? Today we are mostly bilateral, right? That is to say that other than the father's name, right, the family name, which I guess in most in Chinese and European in the spheres, right, you inherit that name, right? But the inheritance actually goes down equally, right? So in the Javanese case or in the Peranakan case, right, in what I've been able to see, right, the sons do get a bigger share, right? But the daughters, right, besides the bridal gift, right? So when the father marries the daughter to somebody else, right, there's a big gift. Besides that, they usually get an additional share, right? And it is Southeast Asian practice for the married women, to keep their own property and have the rights to, right, buy and sell based on that. So that's one. So that said, women didn't really go out and start businesses, right? So they are not entrepreneurial in the way that Chinese men were, right? They held on to land, they held on to their jewelry, they held on to the money. One of the ways in which they exercise that power, right, and it's because of the demographic fact that, right, men tended to die earlier. A lot of the widows, right, then became in charge of huge estates, right, that their husbands left them. And I've actually published a paper, right, on how the colonial state and, right, late 19th century reformers just couldn't get around this fact, right? First things first, in Europe, right, in the West, there's this thing called the law of coverture, right? So the married woman, unless specified in prenuptial contracts, right, do not have the right to control their own property. And then they were in Java and seeing women signing contracts and buying and selling land, right? So by the late 19th century, in collaboration with sinologists, right, who came in to say, look, this is very un-Chinese. You have to be more Chinese, right, by not letting your women, right, dispose of their property and control property this way, right? So it's very ironic, but so I hope I've answered the question. Diane, shall I move on to the next one?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Guo-Quan. Okay, so the next question is from Tao Mao Zhou. Thanks so much for a super interesting presentation, Guo-Quan. I wonder what is the mothering practice in the Peranakan Chinese families? Would children of the primary wife and concubines be raised communally? And a separate question, what economic opportunities do women have outside the domestic realm? Why divorce might improve women's economic conditions? I think you might have touched on this, but.
Yeah. Hi, Tao Mo. Wow, Tao Mo, excellent questions, and we need a research seminar to really get to all this, right? But very, very quickly, there is that Chinese practice of, right, recognizing the primary wife as the mother, as actually the only mother, right? And the concubines don't really count ritually, right? But unfortunately, we know very little, right? It's only as late as the 1950s that there's the first serious ethnographic study, right? But from the legal cases that we see, it's a mix of things, right? So it's really hard to generalize, right? But there is the pattern of, right, the Chinese pattern of recognizing the primary wife as the main mother. What else did Tao Mo ask?
Hang on to find it.
Okay.
Would children of the primary wife and concubines be raised communally? And then the separate question, what economic opportunities do women have outside the domestic realm? Why might divorce improve women's economic conditions?
Yeah, so I think I've answered the second question partially, right? But we see in some cases, women, it tends to be the middle-class women who have more opportunities, right? They would run a shop, a warung, or even a smaller shop, right? In part of the house, right? Selling food, selling whatnot. But the wealthiest elite women, right? Actually, in terms of what they do economically, it tends to be marriage alliances, right? Buying and selling land, trying to, right, keep the lands together, right? And passing it on to the next generation. Okay, maybe we move on to another question.
Yeah, okay. So Bernard Lockman asks, well, he comments, Peranakan women are known for their strong matriarchs, which might strongly correlate with your talk. It reminded me of the story of Queenie Chang's account of her headstrong mother, who was a mere daughter of a tando, a foreman. Along with that narrative, I suspect it has to do with the Dutch colonial rule that only Peranakan's Chinese are allowed to own properties outside Chinese enclaves. I believe many wealthy or not so wealthy Singket men tried to marry Peranakan women to obtain Peranakan status so that they could capitalize in estates. Do you think the more dominant and emancipated nature of Peranakan women has to do with them having the upper hand in the marriage?
Wow.
It's a long question.
Yeah. Bernard, you
interesting
are
one.
clearly a researcher yourself. I'd love to get in touch, right? But as far as I know, the Dutch and the British as well, right? They really ruled by race. So it didn't matter that the Peranakans were local born, and oftentimes, right, by the 20th century, local born for 3, 4 generations, 5 generations, they couldn't own quote unquote native land, right? And the Dutch were fairly consistent, right? The Europeans couldn't own native land as well, right? There's this discourse, this will to quote unquote protect, right? The indigenous people. Singket tried to marry Peranakan to obtain Peranakan status. So you're talking about this very interesting marriage practice, right? Which is fairly common across Southeast Asia, right? They are not as bound as they were in southern China, right? To kind of expand the lineage. So all the big tauques, they will tend to select the most able among their managers, their workers, right, to be their daughters-in-law, right? So it's not so much that the Singke is trying to kind of insinuate into the Peranakan families as the tauques, right, wanting to choose the best successors, right, to their businesses. So one of the most famous cases would be Tang Kaki, right, having Li Kongqian, right, as his son-in-law. Do the more dominant and emancipated nature have to do with their upper hand in the marriage? So I don't think they had upper hand in the marriage, right? So it was still arranged marriages. I think we have this kind of notion that, right, matriarchs are very powerful in Southeast Asia, but actually, if you look at the in Chinese social history, the matriarchs in Chinese history are also very powerful, right? So it has something to do with the structure of the family, right? When you've lived long enough, right, you are the most senior and most elder, right? Even the son, right, has to kind of look up to you and get most decisions by you, right, before he can move forward.
Okay, thank you. Clifford Pereira asks, were there any Chinese-Javanese marriages?
Oh yeah, so in fact, my book is mainly about this, right? And I have to qualify by saying that, right, the Chinese, unfortunately, right, didn't quote unquote marry in the strict legal ritual term, right? They didn't marry Javanese or indigenous women, right? It's a fairly widely practiced across Southeast Asia, right? Chinese men kept local women, right, as concubines, right? And this goes all the way back to the early modern period when, right, suddenly men from Europe and across Asia, right, started appearing on the shores of Southeast Asia. So it really wasn't until post-independence, right, when the nation state moved against this, right? You have to marry. They had campaigns to go against, right, what they call the fostering of mistresses among the Chinese, right? That what is seen as quote unquote illicit, right, ended.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. Tan Kun Siang asks, was there a trend for Chinese to leave Batavia for Malacca when it was given to the British in 1795 in search of trade prospects?
Leave Batavia for Malacca. So that's a very, very good question. And as far as I've seen, right, I hesitate to say that, it's the other way around, but I've seen movements between the two places in the Chinese Council records. So there's, familiarity with the Dutch, right, with the legal system, right, did facilitate some kind of exchange, right? But I'm sorry, I haven't studied this part of the connection, right? But I have seen some references to, right, people from Malacca appearing in Batavia, but not so much from the other side. But I think it might just be that, I haven't looked at the Malacca sources. Yeah.
Okay, great. Questions just come in, which I think is very interesting. What was the place of Peranakans among the hierarchy of the Dutch East Indies compared to Indonesian women, perhaps? And during the Japanese occupation, were they treated in a particular way or were they homogenized with the natives?
Yeah, cool. Let me just, so when, where do I find, okay, I found it. So this person studies Indonesia, right? When she refers to Indo women, he or she is actually referring to Eurasian women, right? They were referred to as Indo. The short answer to your question is, right, and I suggested this earlier on, right? It's by race, right? And if we've read our ancestors, right, we know by the 20th century, there is a will to homogenize, especially white people, right? The same move happened, but very half-heartedly, right, among the Asian groups. So in my book, I talk about how the Dutch passed a monogamous law for the Chinese, but they really didn't really implement it, right? Among the Chinese, there was beginning to be, right, some notions of race consciousness, right? But I argue that the race boundary remains, right, somewhat blurred, right, throughout the late colonial period. During the Japanese period, they're treated apart, right? The Chinese were in a separate group from the natives. This has to do with, right, the history going back to the Sino-Japanese War. But in Java, they were a lot less cruel to the Chinese than in Singapore and Malaya. Yeah.
Thanks, Guo-Quan. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, it's now just past 8 o'clock, so we have to bring the Q&A to a close. I'm so sorry that we weren't able to get to all of you. But it just leaves me to thank Dr. Seng Guo-Quan for being with us this evening and for giving us all his insights from his research. And we look forward to his book with bated breath. So we'll be bringing this webinar to a close now. To all our participants, thank you for being with us, and please help us to improve your ACM webinar experience by scanning the QR code that will be flashed up on the screen for the next 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you, everyone, and have a very good evening ahead.
Thank you.